Welcome back to Google Developers Live. I'm Louis Gray here with Google Developers Live from Mountain View, California at Google headquarters. I have a great guest with me for the second day in a row, Brian Fitzpatrick, coming here to talk to us about data liberation and the data liberation front all the way from sunny Chicago, Illinois.
It's very sunny right now, as a matter of fact.
Welcome, Fitz. It's always good to have you around. And I know from my time prior to joining Google, we got to talk a lot about the work that you're doing in this really kind of unique and individual project with data liberation. We often talk a lot about new products that are coming out, new features that are getting rolled out, but then the users go ahead and use that and they put in a little bit of data, and usually that's the end of the story. And you've done something completely different, which is talking about getting that data out. And so I want to really kind of start at the very top. Let's talk about data liberation front. Where are you coming at with this, and what can users do to get their data out? Why is this important?
Well, I want to answer the important question. I think it's important more than anything because it's the data that you put into products and the data that you create into products in any company that's holding your data for you. It's data that you should be able to control. You should be able to put it in, you should be able to take it out, and you should be able to delete it. And that's the basic argument. The interesting thing is that I found when we were talking about starting the Data Liberation Front is that many companies, Google included, would make it, I would say, possible for you to take your data out, but it wasn't always easy. And so our thought was, instead of doing public relations to say, yes, you can get your data out, it is easy, when it really wasn't, that as an engineering company, we could actually build products and make engineering changes to make it easier for you to take your data out.
And what are those kinds of changes? I know from having used this product myself, you've essentially centralized one place for me to get my data out from multiple services. Is that right?
Correct. Well, Google Takeout is where we are today. But when we first started this project internally back in 2007, which seems like a long, long time ago now, and we basically put together a small team of engineers to go from product to product and say, hey, have you ever considered making it easy for users to export their data? And everyone would say, oh yeah, we've been thinking about it. It's been on our roadmap since like 1993. But it's really low priority because we've got a lot of other stuff we're trying to do, and people aren't beating the door down asking to leave. And so
that's a good thing that they're not trying to leave.
It is a good thing. But I said, what if we come in and help you do the work? What if we did the work with your team? Just parachute in and actually do the engineering work. And everyone was like, oh, this is the best thing ever. Please come right in, have a cup of coffee. And so we started doing that. We went from product to product, whether it was actually Notebook and iGoogle, which were the first things before we warmed up to Blogger, which was the big first project we did. And as we started doing this, the team started to realize that this was just intractable because Google was adding new products all the time. And we have these sort of three questions to ask with your data. Can I get it out? How long is it going to take to get it out, and how much is it going to cost? And we realized that we weren't, the how long was just actually continuing to go linearly. Like every time we add a product, that means one more thing you have to go download. So being engineers, my team was like, this doesn't seem right. I said, well, what would you like to do? If you could do anything you want, what would you guys do? And they went off and they came back to me 2 weeks later and said, we want to create this thing, which turned out to be Takeout, where you can go and get all your data at one place. Just click and get all your data for all of Google products. Now, we're still working on getting some products in, to be clear. But I'm like, that sounds suitably insane. Let's make it happen. And so they started working on that a while back. And we launched that the same day Google Plus launched in 2011. And over the course of the past 2 years...
I remember that was a big day. Not working at Google at that time and trying to cover all the news that was coming out. I know we did a hangout talking about the Google Takeout project.
That's right. That was one of the first hangout press interviews ever. Yeah.
I remember we had a dedicated circle, and those of us dialed in from our homes where we were and learned about it. And there was a lot to cover at that time. You're talking about bringing your data and moving along from project to project, product to product. As someone who's been using the internet for some time, you and I probably have accumulated our own history of number of email addresses and number of email clients that we've had. And prior to Gmail, most of these were like software. And so I've been one of those guys who's kind of like been an email hoarder and moved it from Eudora over to Microsoft Outlook Express and maybe back to Apple Mail or then back over to Gmail. And so we've always thought there was that capability where you could export it and then move it along. But that doesn't seem to be the way that most software works. And maybe I'm one of those odd people who doesn't just abandon my 10-year ago email. What kind of data do you think is the thing that people exploit the most? Like, what is the most valuable to them to get a hold of?
I think, first of all, I like to say that I've got all my email since 1995 in Gmail. And I actually went through recently and searched for something that came from 1996. So it's pretty awesome to have that around.
That's a lot of gigs, Fitz.
It's actually not that much, because back in the 90s, people didn't mail anything around but text.
Right.
Like, I didn't pictures and movies and crazy things like that.
Attachments that you would send could take the company server down.
Yeah, exactly. So you never wanted to and people had limits on their signatures. You remember, anything more than 4 lines, someone yell at you. The thing that I think the most valuable things tend to be things that people don't consider as data. Like, I think contacts are very valuable for one thing, right? Because it's your way of getting a hold of your friends and family and that sort of thing. But the most valuable one that I see really is photos, because photos are very emotional things. The example that I tell people when I meet someone new and they say, "What do you do at Google? Do you work on the doodles with the Pac-Man thing?" And they're, "Oh, that's great." And I said, "No, I don't work on that." And they're just like, "I'm not interested." But I said, what I work on is this Data Liberation Front thing. And if they're not a technical person, they're like, because this is boring to them. Why should they care about data?
It's boring until they really want it.
Well, it's not only that, but it's boring until I say, look, at home, do you have a shoebox full of old photos and letters from your grandparents from back in the day? And they're usually like, yeah, it's up in a closet. It's not very useful to me. I said, you don't share it with folks. You can't look at it very easily and leaf through it and search through it. But if that disappeared, you'd probably be pretty upset. And their response is, of course, this is very emotional, very valuable. I said, it's the same thing with the data that you're creating in your blog or Plus or your photos or your any of this type of stuff. And so I really encourage people to think of their data not as a bunch of ones and zeros, but as something that is your digital legacy. It's that shoebox, but in a much more useful fashion, and it's stored on the internet. And we're sort of custodians of that data, and we need to make sure that we don't lose it, for one. But we also need to make sure that you can take a copy of it with you if you want to go somewhere else or try a different product somewhere, or just have another copy at home for peace of mind, because disk storage is so cheap nowadays.
Yeah, one of the interesting things you have from an engineering perspective is the challenge itself of picking the correct standard and making sure it sticks around for a while. I remember from your introductory video that's quite famous, you kind of walk through the zip drives and the beta disks and the DVDs and the CDs. And over time, some of these places where we used to store data start to seem quaint. Who really carries these floppy disks around? And so how do you approach a problem like that from a technology perspective and say, all of these photos that you're going to be able to export from, be it Picasa or Google Plus Photos or somewhere, what's the right standard to choose? How do you know that it's going to be good to export and possibly good to import somewhere else? And does that ever change?
It does change. Standards change all the time, and the interesting thing about standards is that there's so many to choose from. That's the sort of old adage. But our baseline is for export is we choose open standards that are not encumbered by patents, that are as simple as possible, so that engineers, like the team that works on Data Liberation Front, can easily write a program that could parse it, put it into another product, transform it in some fashion. The interesting thing is that when you have data on your laptop, like you used to years ago, you have a Chromebook, which is an amazing piece of hardware.
This Pixel has maybe 2 megs of content locally on my hard drive, because I never need to do it. It's transitory. If I'm going to take it down, I'm going to put it right back up in the cloud.
It's an extra copy typically, but it's all stored in the cloud. But in the old days, when you had something in your laptop and formats would change, you'd be stuck behind. You'd have to find a translation program or something. On my laptop, I have an old word processor file from 1995. There's no word processor today that will open that file. And it's an actual valid file as far as I know. It's just that file format has gone the way of the dodo.
To the data standard graveyard.
To the data center graveyard, yes. And the interesting thing about that is that if Google has all your data, or some other company online is storing data for many, many people, we can run a program over all that and change from format to format, in many cases, losslessly. And so as new formats come into play, like I think YouTube is an example of this, right? They can transcode your videos for mobile to be, much more bandwidth effective or much less inefficient using bandwidth. They can transcode things for lower resolution, that kind of thing. But they've still got the original there. And in fact, in Takeout, when YouTube went into Takeout, we made sure you could get your original copy, so you're not losing any data there at all.
We're broadcasting on YouTube right now.
Really?
I don't know if you knew that, but it's happening right now this second.
We live the futures now.
That's one of the cool things about broadcasting on YouTube is you have the live version and then you have the archive copy, which people can go in later. And as you mentioned, you can download it. And if you're somebody who's really good with software, you can just make an edit and put it back up. So one of the things I was thinking of, and I get this question a lot when we're talking about Google, and I think we mentioned a little bit yesterday when we were discussing organizational manipulation, is altruism. People tend to not trust companies that provide software or services, and they'll want to know, why is it that you're providing me with this service? Why do you want me to get my data out? Don't you care about the customer being locked in? Don't you want to have more user data? Like, what's your deal?
I disagree with your first statement. I think people don't trust companies, period. Because why should they? The reputation, and if you look at past performance, I think many companies have done things that have shown users that we're not to be trusted. And I don't think that Google's doing any of this data liberation stuff, or we'll talk about transparency tomorrow. None of this is because we're nice people or altruistic, although I think you and I at least are nice people.
That's two down.
Well, yeah, exactly, two down. Several 10,000 to go. But really, it's because it's good for business long term. And I think Google has managed to tie its success with the success of the internet. And it's a very consumer-friendly attitude. And so many times it may look like we're doing this data liberation thing for altruism, but honestly, it's by focusing on keeping users, by engineering innovation, making our products better, making our products faster. I think that it's a better way to compete, and a better way to keep our users. For example, I ask people all the time who are at Google who ask me why we're doing this data liberation thing. I said, well, do you use Google Search? And most of the time they'll say yes. I'll say, did you buy a 2-year contract to use Google Search? And they're like, well, no. I'm like, did you buy a piece of hardware that only works with Google Search? And they'll say, no, of course not. I use my browser. I can go to bing.com if I want to. Mm-hmm. All right, well, why are you still using Google Search? And the response usually is, well, it finds what I want and gets out of my way. It's the best product for my needs. And my argument is that all of our products should be that way. If Blogger isn't the best product for your needs, then you should be able to take your data and go use WordPress or TypePad or something like that. Same goes for photos. Same goes for your G+ stream, that sort of thing.
So you think maybe it puts a little bit of pressure on the services that we provide to get better and make sure that we're maintained as being the best?
Well, I think it's partly that. But I think part of it is the fact that if you lock your users in, your product can be dying on the vine and you're not even going to know it. Because your users will reach a point where they'll just leave without their data. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about us is we have a lot of products. So if you decide you want to leave one of our products today because you found a better product to meet your needs, I would argue that experience of leaving has to be a good experience for you. Otherwise, we're not going to get you to come back next week or tomorrow or the month after to try a new product. And I think that the fact that we're on the internet, where it's super easy to try new products, it's super easy to switch, I think trust is more important than it was years ago when you'd have to go to the store and get a box with a diskette in it or a bunch of diskettes in it and come home and install it and reboot, and then your neighbor kid comes over and tells you got the wrong software and you have to go back to the store. Mm-hmm.
Hopefully they do returns without too much damage.
But they don't, because it's a shrink-wrapped EULA, right? And so we're in a different place. Like most software on the web you can try for at least either a reduced functionality version or for a limited period of time, see if you like it. And if you like it, then you go ahead and continue to use it, or you buy it, or whatever, whether it's ad driven or you pay a subscription. So there's a lot of I think there's a lot of things that have changed in the past 15 years that mean that trust is important. And I think that's one of the most valuable things that we have, and I think data liberation is a way of protecting that.
Now, you talked about this at the very beginning, like the initial sell, I guess, for the data liberation front. You kind of had to go product to product, person to person, and say, I have this idea, how can I help you?
Yeah.
Is that still the case? I mean, the data liberation front, you say you started in 07, I think it was announced in 09, Takeout was introduced in 2011,
yeah.
And so it's been around for a little bit of a while. How do you go about going to the next product and trying to make a case? Is it harder now? Is it easier now? Like when Google products are made, do they have Takeout in mind? Or is it still kind of going back to the start?
It's a lot easier now. I mean, it's a lot easier now because people have internally, Googlers have seen the value, the benefit, the user trust that they get, that products get from having takeout integration. So typically what happens nowadays is a product, either an existing product or one that hasn't launched yet, will come to us and say, hey, we want to be in takeout. And we have a little integration document that's super straightforward and very simple, and we've refined it over the years to make sure that it's actually easy to follow, that they can go ahead and implement the following little bit of API and then do a last little tie-in with us. And it's relatively straightforward to make it easy for us to put your data into takeout. So we get a lot of products come directly to us and say, hey, we want to do this. In some cases, some products ask us for help. In some cases, we go and say, hey, we'd like to have your product in takeout. But we're very selective about the ones that we go after. But it's never a fight. I mean, it's always like, hey, this is great. Thank you guys for helping us out.
And do you ever find this kind of like a user swell? Like if person's 1 through 1 million say, I want to get my data out of product X, does that help your push and say, I need to go and extract more data out of, say, G+ or Chrome or one of the other supported services?
I think it's... I don't think there's ever been that real problem. I think the push, the really hard pushes always come from myself and the team itself. They always want it to be better. I mean, the team of engineers that have working in data liberation are some of the finest engineers I've ever worked with. They've got to dive into parts of Google's code base across the board, and it's a real challenge just from a systems point of view. They're dealing with lots of data in some cases. YouTube, for example, those videos can get very big. They're dealing with lots of smaller files in other cases. And they're dealing with basically securely authenticating across systems. We can't just go and grab your data. We need to make sure that we're passing your authentication along the way, and we securely get it. So we can never look at it at any point or anything like that.
Now, you brought up something as an interesting point. You were talking about the Pixel, and I've transitioned to being full Chrome OS. I've been that way for probably a year and a half now. But what's interesting with me is I don't have a shoebox in the closet. What I have are old laptops, right? So I've got like a Mac that I stopped using when I changed jobs in 2009. I've got a Mac that I used from 2009 to 2011. I've got the Mac I got when I started working here. And then I've got the Pixel. And so I kind of have like a slice of time in my own history of my data. Like, here are the photos of when my kids were 2 to 4. Here's the photos when my kids were 4 to 5. And what I've done is taken a lot of work to kind of get it all into the cloud and get it protected. And when you start to think about that as a service owner or a service manipulator, going back to yesterday, how much additional pressure is to get that right when the cloud starts to take up an increasing percentage of users' data, so that they probably don't have a local copy anymore? Like, how much more challenging is it to make sure you've got the right standards and that we don't delete anything?
Well, I think it's always a challenge to make sure that we never lose any data. That would be horrible. Like, that's a big trust issue. And that's why a lot of the times, we talk about the fact that we store multiple copies across multiple physical locations in case, like, data center over here gets hit by a meteor. We want to make sure that your data is still available to you immediately, because people have an expectation. They go in to show their child's photo to someone else, and I'm sorry, your data center's down for maintenance or something. That would be very awful. So I think there's a huge pressure to that. But the one thing I would tell anyone, I do tell anyone that I talk to, is please have multiple copies of your data. If you have a copy in Google, you should make a backup copy to have on a home server or a home laptop or somewhere, or take that copy and push it up somewhere else. But you should always have multiple copies of your data. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard from people, many of my friends, who have lost every picture of their kids. One of my friends lost every picture of her son from birth to age 3 because it was all on one laptop that she got stolen.
Right, one hard drive crash or one got stolen.
Yeah, it scares the heck out of me. It's horrifying.
Yeah, so pleasant. So every conversation we're like, ooh, better make it happy at the end. So when we download this data, like, what services let you import it? Sometimes we talk about, is Google the only company that can provide a service like this? And we can answer that question as well. But, if I take my data out of Google, is it really easy to get it into other places, other equivalent networks? Do they have the ability to kind of have an import tool that's as good as our export? Or is it still a challenge?
Well, I think it's a chicken and an egg issue, but I think if the data's not available, you're never going to get the import parts done. But like, there's some examples where it's very easy, like photos. You pull out your photos, you get a bunch of JPEGs or whatever the heck photo format your photo was initially in, and it's easy to take those and put them up anywhere else, I would say. In contacts, for example, contact import's very straightforward. VCards, calendars, very straightforward with iCal format. Documents, spreadsheets, word processor documents, spreadsheets, those type of things. We give you a couple of choices. You can, if you want to stick in the open formats, you can use open office formats. If you're working with folks who use Microsoft Office, you can choose the Microsoft Office formats. So those are the typical easy examples. It gets a little harder when there's not a defined standard for moving data from one system to another. For example, Blogger. There's no blog format. So what we do is we create a simple Atom feed. We've documented the format publicly. We have created an open source project. I believe it's called Google Blog Converters, and you can find that on Google Code. And you can take, and that is a reference implementation that will translate our format into, I think it's like WordPress and Typepad and maybe something else, and back. So, and that's under the Apache license. So any developer at any other company can take that and say, look at this, say, oh, this is how this works. This is how we parse this document format. This is how we can put it in our format. So that's there and that's available. I'm not sure who made use of it or not yet, but that is, I think, the solution to dealing with formats where there's no real web standard for them, but we're using an ad hoc standard to simple XML container.
And what are the kind of services today that are supported by Data Liberation Front?
Wow, well, Takeout's got a ton of stuff in it. I mean, we initially launched with social services, so it was photos, it was your contacts, it was your circles, your G+ stream, probably something else. And then pretty quickly after that, we added Google Voice. Then we added Google Drive, which is docs and spreadsheets. And we just continued adding things to it over time. And so we've got YouTube and dozens of other products. And we're still working on adding the last few. So my team won't rest until everything's in there, pretty much.
Right. You've got more to go. Now, you actually introduced something that's a little bit of a deviation. Earlier this year, you talked about legacy account management. Mm-hmm. And for those who are unfamiliar, we can talk about that. But that's essentially if your account is closed or if you pass on, that your data becomes available to someone who you've designated it to. Is that correct?
That's the inactivity manager, correct, okay. Yes. Yeah, that we worked with a team to provide that so that if you don't log into Google for a specified period of time, I think the minimum is either 3 or 6 months, up to a year, you can say, notify this person and give them access to these pieces of my data. And as opposed to leaving somebody, your username and your password. Mm-hmm. This way you can just say, if I don't log into Google for 6 months, something happens, delete all my email but give all my photos to so-and-so.
Right.
Right.
And that's another way we're utilizing the same kind of backup, the same kind of takeout, and the same kind of open standards could be reused for a new way to help the people out there.
Absolutely. In fact, that uses the same exact systems that takeout works on.
Yeah, absolutely. So what else can you tell our viewers when we take a look at Data Liberation Front? What should they be thinking about when it comes to either putting their data into a service or taking it out? You said there's really 3 steps.
Well, yeah, so there's 3 questions that you should ask before using any software application that's storing data for you. And the first question, I think, is the obvious one: is can I get my data out in open format? And that's sort of like table stakes. If the answer to that is no, then I'm out of here. Or if I do use your product, I'm going to be very careful about what I put in it because I know it's locked up. The second question is, what does it cost me to get it out? And that answer should always be nothing else. So if it's a free service, it should be free to get your data out. If your service costs $20 a year, $50 a year, that should include export of your data. And the third question, I think, is more of the tricky one, is how much of my time does it take to get my data out? And the example that I give here is photos, and this is where PR often has solved these problems in the past. Someone would say, hey, can I get my photos out of this product? And the PR answer is, well, of course you can. This is open and it's free. And you basically go to the photo and you click, say it download, save as, go to desktop and hit OK.
2,000 times.
Yeah, 2,000 times. Or 5,000 or 10,000 times, And so take a week off of work and click your mouse button.
Just do a right click, save as.
Yes, exactly.
Repeat 168,000 times and you're in a good spot.
Right. So, this is why you should have one I hesitate to say one click, but a minimal amount of numbers. The amount of data you have shouldn't correspond to the amount of time it takes you to get that data out. And so I think those are the three things that are most important, and those are the things that I really think about before I start using any online service, because people often say, "Oh, well, this stuff doesn't matter to me. My stream is important. It's trivial. My tweets aren't important." But the interesting thing is that there's no way to know today what's important in the future. I look back to emails that I wrote back in the mid-'90s, and I'm like, "Oh wow, gosh, these were dumb." But it's really neat because I found early emails that my wife and I sent back and forth when we were dating. And early messages with some of my friends from college, and some messages with one of my friends who died a couple years ago, and it's like that. Suddenly, this stuff is valuable to me. If you'd asked me at the time, I'd be like, "Oh no," but I'm just a digital pack rat, so I keep everything.
And I think everybody has a story like that. I mean, you talk about those types of emails that kind of jogged a memory with me. My wife and I were dating, and we were trading emails constantly, and somehow in a blitz, I lost several months worth of that. And so we go from dating, and the next thing you know, we're planning the wedding. And I missed all this stuff in between. I don't remember if I said anything cool. What was it? It's gone. Probably nothing cool, but it would be good to have that back sometime, and I'm glad at least we're doing this. So Fitz, thank you so much for coming back in.
My
I definitely
pleasure.
want people who are curious about this to take a look at dataliberation.org. dataliberation.org. It's still free to log in, free to check it out. And that is the Data Liberation Front. And so, Fitz, I know we're going to be back here tomorrow here in Mountain View before you fly back to Chicago.
One more day and you throw me out.
That's right. That's all we can get. But thank you very much for checking in at Google Developers Live. I'm Louis Gray, and we'll see you in the studio.